Your most valuable asset is time, not money. And a rich life is about spending that time well. That's one of my most favorite financial quotes of all time. I don't recall exactly who said it, but I think it really hits the nail on the head. So many individuals that financial advisors alike spend so much time trying to ask the question or protect against the question of how do I not run out of money during my lifetime? But very few of us consciously, I mean, really consciously, focus on answering the question, how do I keep from running out of time? I'm John Llodra. I'm a co-founder and partner here at New Harbor Financial Group. I'm also a certified financial planner. I've spent nearly a quarter century working with individuals and families on these very things, certainly investment strategy and saving strategy, but also, very importantly, on spending strategies. And there's a mechanical part to this and a mathematical part to this, and that's important. But just as importantly, if not more so, is a psychological aspect of having the confidence and lack of fear to actually give you the fortitude and the confidence to spend during your retirement. I can tell you, in all the years I've been doing this, very rarely have I ever had a client that truly, truly ever was at risk of running out of money. Yeah, there were times where things were tight and maybe they had to be a little bit more frugal, but very rarely can I ever remember a true scenario of running out of money. In fact, more often than not, is our scenarios where clients die with a whole bunch of money left over. And yes, many of them have children or causes that they are gratified to know will be inheriting their funds. But I bet you most of the clients that have passed on, if they had to do over again, would have lived a little bit more. Not recklessly, not indulgently, but lived a little less in fear and a little bit more with enjoyment and fulfillment and meaningful time on their minds, empowered by the savings that they've been able to accumulate. So I want to talk about some of those real world experiences. And so this is a personalized question for each viewer. And I invite any viewers here today to reach out to us, the team here at New Harbor Financial Group. We're happy to relate our experiences, learn about your situation with a no obligation consultation. Please feel free to like and subscribe to this video, and we put out content all the time. So the first thing I want to touch upon is you actually have to get to that finish line, so to speak, of being able to retire. You've had to have saved enough so that you can turn off your real paycheck and turn on your own paycheck from your own savings. And I'm going to reserve later in this video to talk about some of the basics, the real critical points in answering that question. How much do I need and how much can I withdraw? Those are very, very important questions to ask and answer first. I'm going to save that for later in the video. Some very important points I want to point out. But let's for now assume that you've checked those boxes, that you have enough. You have enough, and now it's a matter of putting that into a retirement strategy, a spending strategy, so that you can live the kind of hopefully meaningfully fulfilling retirement period that you have always dreamt about. So the first thing is we think about longevity. Most folks, if they retire in their mid 60s, let's say, and you look at standard life expectancy tables, we're talking about a retirement period for most people, say 25, 30, 35 years or longer, depending on whether longevity runs in their family or not and what their health status is. But we're talking about a long period of time. And for some people, that time may rival the number of years that they actually worked and saved. So we're talking about a long period of time. So it's understandable that many folks would be fearful about spending too much of their savings out of fear of running out of that money. Now, one of the dangers of longevity planning is it treats all years the same. So if we assume someone's going to have a retirement period of 30 years, for all intents and purposes, a financial planning model, even the best of them, is going to say every one of those 30 years is the same in terms of the importance of funds being there. But in reality, when you look at the real lives of people, that's typically not the case. A client of mine shared a great article he came across. It happened to be on a topic we were talking about with respect to his and his wife's situation. I think the title of the article was something to the effect of 12 good years. And the notion of the article was that, yeah, you may have a life expectancy of 30 years in retirement, but it's maybe 10 to 15 years during the early years of your retirement that matter the most insofar as, kind of living the lifestyle that you truly want to live. Because if you do the math, most folks, once they start to get above, say, 80 years old, let's just pick an arbitrary number, no matter how healthy they are, no matter how active they've been or how well they've cared for their health, they start to slow down. You can't do the same kinds of things that you wanted to do earlier in life. You don't have the same stamina, perhaps, to go on a 10-mile walking tour of the vineyard in France, whatever one's wishes might be. Point being, it's the early years of retirement that oftentimes are the most meaningful in terms of how one may choose to spend their time and spend their money creating those kinds of experiences. So that's the first thing. And there's some real practical planning implications to this. The first is that, we oftentimes think about, set fixed withdrawal rates over the full course of one's life. But in fact, it may be more prudent. In fact, I do think it's prudent to think about, spending more earlier in life when you can actually make more meaningful use of those funds. But it also gets into things like there is a risk of actually saving too much or maximizing income over your lifetime when it's you really what you want to try to do is maximize the utility of that income during your lifetime. So, for example, choosing if one has a pension available through their employer, a defined benefit pension plan, or even like Social Security, most folks qualify for Social Security. Typically, the longer you wait to start that income stream, the higher the income per month or per year you're going to get. Now, if you assume a longevity, like a long lifespan, the simple math is the longer you wait, the more income you're going to get over your lifetime. And that may maximize your lifetime income, but it may be decidedly suboptimal in terms of maximizing the usefulness of that income. Wouldn't it make more sense to have, take Social Security at your normal retirement age? Yeah, maybe you get a slightly lower monthly benefit, but you're able to use it for years early in your life when you can actually make more use of it than a higher income later on in life. Just one simple example. So it gets to questions like, what kind of work? Do I still need to keep on working? Maybe I work a different kind of job. I quit the job that I don't really enjoy. Maybe it pays well, but I go work part-time. Because I do want to keep working because I enjoy work, but I also want more free time. So maybe, a part-time employment that pays less, pays what I might refer to as a paycheck rather than a paycheck, but allows you to kind of start to enjoy the fruits of your labor and savings. The next idea or concept that I'd like to raise is that money increasingly, especially during a retirement period, can we think should start to be thought of as, experiences or maximizing your enjoyment in life. And to that end, I'd like to call it a book that I was introduced to, a book called Die with Zero. And the title is quite provocative. The title Die with Zero gives a notion of or impression of hedonistic living, go out and have a great time, party till you run out of money, and hopefully everything works out. That's not at all what the book is about. And I was introduced to this book actually on a trip that my wife and I took to Italy. It was our second ever European trip, a trip to Italy a couple of years ago. And there were three other couples traveling together from the Southeast, and they all read this book together. It's called Die with Zero. And the whole notion of the book is that, money can be used during your lifetime in ways that can hopefully be more meaningful to you and those that you care about. The author, raises the notion of using money as a way to create memory dividends. You have experiences in your life, and those memories can last the rest of your lifetime. And they don't need to be memories that you have by yourself. They can be memories you have with your spouse or friends or even your extended family. Think about grandparents having, perhaps ample resources for their own needs, and they have a pretty good likelihood or idea that when they pass, there'll be an inheritance for their children. An example here of a memory dividend would be those same grandparents saying, you know what, we want to use some of our resources now. Maybe we can travel with our children and grandchildren together while we're still all alive and really enjoy our time together. Doesn't need to be a lavish or expensive vacation, but something that has every bit the meaning and purpose that one hopes their hard-earned savings can turn into. Another example is, sometimes the mismatch of when funds are inherited by a beneficiary maybe is at a time in their life when it's not quite as impactful. Again, let's think about a grandparent who has parents who have grown children who in turn have their own children. Typically, when those first generation parents would pass, maybe the grandchildren are already done with college, they've grown up and maybe are even established in their own careers. Might it not be an interesting exercise to think about, well, using some of those funds during my life to perhaps maybe help my children help their children pay for college or other experiences. All to say is that the timing of those funds makes all the difference. Sometimes An inheritance at death is at a time when maybe one's children have already established a secure financial footing, whereas earlier in their life they could have used it more impactfully. So it's really about maximizing the experiences and the utility of those hard-earned savings than simply maximizing the amount of money during one's lifetime. So I realize much of what I'm talking about here today is very commonsensical, but it's very hard for many people to actually get over the psychological barriers to doing this. And this is where it comes back to, sound planning and actually doing the math, so to speak, actually modeling out, reassuring oneself, or if you're if you work with a financial advisor like myself or the team here at New Harbor, working with your financial advisor to actually plot out what if scenarios to give you that analytical comfort level that you do have enough and that you can loosen the purse string, so to speak, to live the kind of life that you want to live. Because fear is real, and the best way to address those fears is to ask the questions and find the answers. They don't have to be rosy answers, but even an answer that illuminates, hey, I can be okay if I do this. Maybe it's not a lavish spending lifestyle, but it doesn't need to be lavish to be comfortable and stress-free. So, certainly I invite any viewers here today to reach out to the team here at New Harbor Financial Group for a no obligations consultation. We're just happy to spend time learning about your situation and talking about that. So I want to pivot back to, again, the all-important question is, how much do you need to retire to get to that level to even be considering these questions about how much can I spend and what should I spend it on? And there are a lot of ways to answer that question, but going through a financial planning exercise is really important to put some math to it. And one way to think about this is in terms of what we call a sustainable withdrawal rate. There are a lot of different methods or rules of thumb. Some of them think about withdrawal rates in terms of a fixed annual amount that maybe adjusts for inflation. Others maybe are a more dynamic rule where it gives you, the amount fluctuates with perhaps the investment performance on your retirement nest egg. There's no one right answer there. But for today, I want to focus on one specific rule of thumb, and it's simply called the 4% withdrawal rule. So let's take a look at what this 4% withdrawal rule looks like. This is a graphic put together by Fidelity in a paper they put out in the spring of 2025, and it was entitled something to the effect of "How long will my savings last in retirement?" Here's the full link to that paper. I encourage you to take a look. But this 4% withdrawal rate is quite simple. It's basically the amount that a retiree should plan to be able to take safely from their retirement nest egg. And the math goes like this. So if we assume hypothetically that this particular retiree has a nest egg of $500,000 saved for retirement, you multiply that by 4% or 0.04, and you end with a withdrawal amount of $20,000. Okay. Now, the whole premise of this particular withdrawal rule is that you're going to give yourself a raise for inflation over time. So in year two, that $20,000 increased by an inflation rate of 2.5% equals 20,500. In year three, so on and so forth. Year three, that withdrawal rate increases to $21,000. So in other words, an increasing withdrawal rate or increasing income amount to hopefully keep pace with inflation. So this may seem like a fairly arbitrary rule of thumb, but there's actually some analytical rigor behind it. So in the same Fidelity study, they went back to 1926 and modeled the so-called maximum sustainable withdrawal rate for different starting retirement periods, assuming a 28-year retirement period. Okay, and you can see the years of the starting period are on the x-axis here, and the maximum sustainable withdrawal rate are on the y-axis. And you can see the rate, and the title points this out, market performance during retirement will affect your sustainable withdrawal rate. That may seem elementary and obvious, but it is critical reality. And you can see in some years, the sustainable withdrawal rate was over 10%. And others barely exceeded the 4%. But you can see, at least in this historical example, there weren't any 28-year periods where the sustainable withdrawal rate was modeled to be less than 4%. So that's kind of one analytical underpinning why this 4% withdrawal rate, quote unquote, works. Now, of course, there are assumptions here. You need to read the footnotes, and this shouldn't be viewed as personalized financial advice for anybody. The only way to really look at this is to look at your own situation. But again, I want to highlight the fact that the market performance is a key determinant of the sustainable withdrawal rate. And that leads us to valuations. And I'll go back to this chart here. If you look at some of the worst periods, you go back, for example, in the early 70s, the market was overvalued. We had inflation, stagflation of the 70s. Those were one of the most difficult times to have started a retirement period of withdrawing your savings. Contrast that with, for example, the early 80s when valuation metrics were really, really low. In 1982, we reached a generational low in valuation records. There was hardly a better time in modern history, post-war history, to invest in the early 80s because the valuations of the stock market were really, really low. On sale, you might say, steeply on sale. And that's why you have, withdrawal rates, sustainable withdrawal rates that were modeled to be, approaching 10%, if not in excess of 10%. So valuations are a key determinant of that. And that brings us to this next chart. And this is a current chart of a key valuation metric called the Shiller cyclically adjusted PE ratio. And you can see this chart is pulled together as of May 12th, 2026. And we are at literally one of the most overvalued times of all history. The only time in this history, going back to the before 1900, where this valuation metric was higher, was in the very tippity top of the tech bubble of 2000. And the takeaway from this is pretty stark. And this is a chart that I've shared before in some of our videos. This is a chart courtesy of Grantham Mayo Van Otterloo, a big Boston-based institutional investment manager. And they talked about lost decades, even for what you might call the traditional balance to 60% stocks, 40% bond portfolio. Lost decades. And what you see here, there are many examples, and that they're more common than you think, where you have lost decades of investment returns. And these returns are on a real basis, basically adjusted for inflation. So you can see negative, this is from 1900 right through essentially more recent times. But look at the peak of the tech bubble. You had a decade here where on an inflation adjusted basis, this 60-40 portfolio lost 1.6% per year. Look at the 70s that I talked about a couple slides ago. You had barely positive inflation adjusted returns for 11 years. Look at the period around the Great Depression. You had 13 years of essentially flat, no growth on an inflation adjusted basis. Now, the other thing I want to tease out of this chart is it wasn't really flat returns. It was each one of these cases were defined by very steep market sell-off. So right here, for example, that was an over 50% drop in the S&P 500. Here again, in the wake of the housing bubble, they look like little blips on this chart, but these were massive, massive bear markets in the stock market. So as was the case here in the early 70s, 73, 74 bear market. Of course, we had the Great Depression right here. Huge decline here. It looks like a barely an event on this chart. But that's the key. And if there's one thing I want to impart is the importance of sequence of returns during your retirement period. This is an example zooming in on a hypothetical example of someone who has $1 million in a nest egg and they start to withdraw at 5%, not 4%, but 5%, a little bit more aggressive withdrawal rate, and give yourself a raise for inflation at 2.5%. Now, if you look at the actual returns in the S&P 500 from 1973 to 1997, there were two big down years, the bear markets of 73, 74. And in this example, this nest egg would have run out of money before the end of the 25-year period, even though the average annual return of that period of time was 10.1%, a very satisfactory return. It was the sequence of return that was the death knell. Now, if you simply take those same returns and reverse the order, so make 1973 the last year and 1997 1997 the first year, same average return, but the big losses happen later on at the end of a retirement period, completely different outcome. You can see the ending value of the portfolio in this scenario keeps growing. So the key takeaway here, it's not enough to reach the finish line of having a nest egg. It's critically important that one manage their retirement savings in a really risk-conscious way. because during the accumulation years, it doesn't matter what the path of return is, but that path of return is critically important during the distribution phase of your retirement. It can be literally be game over if early on in your retirement period you suffer big declines. So the bottom line, way more important than whether or not you spend money on a vacation in your early years of retirement, is making sure that you take defensive measures to not take more risk than you can afford and suffer big losses in your investment portfolio. I can say for most folks that have reached the finish line of having a sufficient nest egg, your biggest risk is not catching late stage market returns and missing out on a couple of percentage points of upside. Your big risk is having big downside that wipes out years, if not decades, of hard sacrifice and savings. So I want to end with this real important point. It's okay to have fears about running out of money, but taking action both in a risk managed investment approach, but also in modeling out and planning out with real numbers, your spending strategy, and making sure that you have, a reasonable likelihood of being able to provide for what you need and not live in unnecessary fear of running out of money. I hope you found this video helpful. Please feel free to like and share this video. I welcome your comments, both on the content here, but also on other topics you'd like I or the team here at New Harbor Financial Group to present in future videos. Until next time, I want to wish you a wonderful day.